The next step in creating the model for my sports events application is to create the data structures that I need. When I parse the JSON, I'm going to need to take the data and put it in some sort of instance of a data structure. Each sports event is made up of 3 pieces of information: sport, matchup, and date. I've decided to create a struct to hold these 3 pieces of information. As previously mentioned, sport, rather than being a string in my struct, is going to be an enumerated value. So I'm going to need to create an enum for sport. Matchup is going to be a string, and then date is not going to be a string. I'm going to use a string to create a Swift date type. So the next thing that I need to do is to create an enum to represent my 5 sports. So I'm going to click on the model folder to select it, hold the Control key down, click, and select New File. I'm going to create an iOS Swift file, and this Swift file is going to hold my sport enum. So I'm going to call it the same thing as the enum. It's going to be sport.swift. And I am placing this file in the model directory. In the sport.swift file, I'm going to create my enum, and the enum is going to be named sport. The cases are going to be baseball. You'll notice as I'm typing baseball, autocomplete wants to access this baseball icon or basketball icon, and if I hit enter, it's going to throw that icon in this place. And I kind of feel this is a failure of autocomplete because it makes it really hard to type the cases here. But the way we can do this is type baseball, then click outside of it, click back, and hit enter. So I'm going to do this for the rest of the cases. The next one is basketball. Click out of it, click back, hit enter. Case football. Case hockey. And finally, case soccer. Now this is a valid enum of type sport that contains my 5 sports. I want to enhance this enum a little bit because it's going to make my life a lot easier when I write the application. First thing is I'd like this enumeration to have a raw value that is of type string. That is, I can create instances of the enum using a raw value, and I can also get the raw value from an instance. And the way that I create a raw value of type string is by putting :string after the type sport. The strings that are going to represent each of my cases will exactly match the cases that I have. So baseball, the case, is also going to have a raw value of baseball, the string. In addition, when I have one of these enumerated values, let's say I have a variable that's holding an enum of baseball, I would like to get the baseball icon that is associated with this enumerated value. And I can use a computed property to return a UI image for my icon when I call it on one of the instances of the enumeration. To do this, I can say var image. So this is going to be my image computed property. I'm going to access it on an instance of this enumeration by saying the instance.image. The image type is going to be an optional UI image type, and it's optional because it's possible that when we request it, it can't actually create an instance of a UI image based on this case. And that would happen, for example, if I don't have an image asset to go with a particular case. I do for all of my cases, but since it's going to be possible that an asset may not exist for a particular case, I'm going to have to make it a UI image optional. That is, it needs the ability to fail at loading the image. And what I'm going to return is a UI image. And I notice as I type UI image optional and as I type to create an instance of a UI image here, I am getting errors, and I'm also not getting an autocomplete to create a UI image. Something's not right here. It says use of undeclared type UI image. And the reason for this is because of the import foundation that was automatically created for us here at the top. UI image is not part of foundation. It's part of UI kit. So I'm going to replace import foundation with import UI kit. As soon as I do that, the error on UI image optional goes away because now this type is understood. And if I type UI image parentheses, it gives us the initializers, the thing that allow us to construct instances of UI images. And the initializer that I want is the UI image named, and I give it a string. Because each of my icons is named something. So the icon for baseball is called baseball icon. The icon for basketball is basketball icon. So if we give it the name baseball icon when the case is baseball, or basketball icon if the case is basketball, we're going to be able to load the UI image associated with that name and return it when the image property is accessed on an instance of a sport. So the string that I need to supply is based on the raw value of the instance of the enum that I have, concatenated with the string icon. And I can access the raw value off of self. Self is a way inside of a type to refer to the instance itself. So self.rawValue is going to return a string that represents the particular case that we're in. So again, if I have an enumeration that is a baseball enumerated value and I call .image on it, self.rawValue here would be the string baseball. And what I have to concatenate onto the end of this is the word icon, so that I end up loading a UI image of the name baseball icon. Again, looking at the assets, baseball icon is named baseball icon, capital I, lowercase baseball. And again, because we said here on the enumeration that it has a raw value of type string, self.rawValue is going to return a string representing the case, and on that we're going to concatenate icon. UI image is going to attempt to create an instance of a UI image based on an image of this name. And again, we have one for each of the cases that we have here. But because a name doesn't mean that a UI image actually exists in the project of that name, we have to make this a UI image optional, because this could fail to actually load an image of this name. And if we hold the Option key down and click on this, you'll notice that there's information here about the UI image class that you could read about. So this is our enumeration. We're going to be able to create an enumerated value for each of our sports, and we're going to be able to use that enumerated value to get the raw value as a string, and also to get an image that is associated with the case. Now I'm going to create the struct that is used for each sports event instance. To create the sports event struct, I'm going to select the model folder, hold the Control key, click, and select a new file, iOS Swift file, and then in the model folder I'm going to create a file to hold the struct for my sports event. So I'm going to call this file sports event Swift. The struct is going to be called sports event, and it is going to have three properties. The first property is the sport. So we're going to say let sport be of type, and we said we wanted to use the enumeration rather than a string. So it's going to be a sport of type sport. Next is going to be the matchup. And this is coming from right here, this matchup. And the one after that is date. So the next one is matchup. It's going to be a string. And then finally, we're going to have the date, which is going to be of type date. So this struct is going to hold our sports event, and now we need to create the code to initialize a sports event. That is to build one when we need it. So I'm going to actually create two initializers. The first is going to be an initializer that receives a sport as of type sport, a matchup of type string, and a date of type date. This is the information I'm going to receive when I want to create a sports event instance. So I can use the pieces that I've received and assign it to the properties of the struct. Now, since the parameters have the same name as the properties, I need to be able to differentiate between them. The properties can be accessed when there's confusion about whether we're talking about a parameter or property using self. So self.sport is going to access this property, self being a way we refer to the instance inside of it, and then sport being the property on it. And that sport property is going to be set to the sport that's passed in as a parameter. The second property is going to be matchup. So we say self.matchup, which refers to the property in the instance, and that's going to be set up to set equal to matchup the parameter, and then finally self.date equals date. Now when I parse my JSON, I am not going to have sport as a sport. I'm going to have sport as a string, and I'm going to have date as a string. And I'm going to need a way to convert the sport into an enumeration and then create a date that is a date type. And I have a couple of options for doing this. I could create an initializer that receives sport as a string, matchup as a string, date as a string, and then convert those the sport into an enumeration and the date into a date type. The option that I'm actually going to use is to let the JSON parser convert the dates that are strings into dates, but I'm going to receive the sport name as a string, and then here I'm going to convert the sport name into a sport enumerated value. So I'm going to create a failable initializer. So that's init question mark. And a failable initializer is one that can return nil. It can fail at being able to create an instance. And why might this happen? Well, if, for example, we receive a sport name that can't be converted into a sport enumerated value, then we can't proceed to create an instance. If we take a sport name and we don't have an equivalent sport enumeration, then we can't create an instance of a sports event from it. So when we try to convert the sport name into a sport, if we fail, we're going to return nil. And if we succeed, then we'll use that sport to initialize an instance of sports event. So failable initializer, the parameters that we're going to receive are sport name as a string, matchup as a string, and date as a date, because the parser is going to take the date string and convert it to a date before calling this initializer to create an instance of a sports event. So I need to create a sport enumeration from the sport name. So I could say, let sport equal sport, parenthesis, and sport can be initialized using a raw value. And the raw value is the string. So I'm going to pass in sport name to create a sport. Now, you may have noticed that the initializer, I'm going to back this up, parenthesis, raw value, returns a sport optional. This is a failable initializer. And the reason? We might get a string that doesn't actually represent a sport, and therefore a sport couldn't be created. So let's say we passed in the word pizza for a sport. Pizza is not one of our sports, so a sport enumeration can't be created from it because the only sports we have are football, hockey, baseball, basketball, and soccer. So when I use this and I pass in the sport name, it is possible that this will fail. And I want to know if it does fail. So I can say here, if let do something. So if we can create a sport and unwrap it, because it's an optional type, into sport, then we're going to proceed to use it to create a sports event. On the other hand, if this sport isn't created and it fails, then we're not going to be able to unwrap it. We're going to have an else condition where we're going to return nil to indicate that we were unable to initialize an instance, and this failable initializer will have failed if return nil gets called. Now, if we do have a sport, then I can call the other initializer that is in my struct, the one we previously created, to initialize an instance. So I can say self dot init, and the one that I want is the one that receives a sport, a matchup, and a date as a sport type and a date type. So the sport that I just created in this if let can be passed in as the sport. The matchup, which is already a string, can be passed in as matchup, and the date, which I'm receiving as a date type, can be passed in as a date. So this will proceed to create an instance, and this concludes my creation of the sports event struct that I will use when I'm parsing the JSON to create instances of sports events.